Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. We've just opened the room, so people will be joining over the next few moments. And I will set up the process in just a few moments. And hello from wherever you are in the world. We're delighted to have you with us. And to have the opportunity to hear our three distinguished panelists and to engage in them with questions and conversation from your own experience. Mari, thank you for your message in the chat, supporting the discussion amongst everyone. And yes, please do feel free to put in the message where you are. And if you are working in the field of modern slavery, feel free to add your organization as well, so that we have a sense of participation. So we'll make a start. And again, welcome to everyone from wherever you are in the world, dialing in to join this distinguished panel, reflecting on what's working in tackling modern slavery. In the history of humanity, slavery has a long and terrible presence. And in more recent centuries, the movement against modern slavery has a long and glorious contribution. And we are delighted to welcome today three members of that global movement to hear from them, from their different experiences and expertise. And this webinar is in honor of all those at risk or victims of modern slavery, and to celebrate the work of everyone who is involved in that movement, as speakers, as participants, as those listening to this recording. My name is John Gray. I'm a member of the faculty team at the Academy of Executive Coaching. Some practicalities for everyone. Please do post your questions, your comments, your reflections, anything that interests you as you hear the three speakers talk. Please put that in the chat. And if you have particular questions for the panelists, we will be able to turn to those within the latter part of the webinar. We're recording this so that those who are not able to be here today can listen, and also we will share the recording within our own networks. Please feel free when you get the recording link to do the same. The Academy of Executive Coaching is an organization that provides training and coaching. Executive means work-based, so supporting people through coaching in their professional contexts. And we've had a commitment to support the global movement against modern slavery since 2019. The reason that we focus our social efforts around slavery is executive coaching is about encouraging workplaces to be at their best. And slavery, of course, is about workplaces at their absolute worst. Hence our connection to supporting the movement. We are not experts in working with survivors. That's not our gift. And indeed, Daniel, it was a colleague of yours at the Wilberforce Institute who first gave us advice, Christina Tallons, about bring your support to those who are working in this world. That could be where your contribution is. So we offer awareness raising, training and coaching skills, pro bono training, and coaching for people in modern slavery organizations. We'll say more about that at the end. And I've been lucky to be involved in that work as part of the AUEC in supporting the modern slavery work over the last few years. And my personal connection to all three speakers, Daniel, as mentioned, it was a colleague of yours who encouraged us in this work. And you and I are not far away across the north of England. Irin, I had the honour of hearing you speak at a Justice and Care event, supporter event in the autumn last year, and delighted to have your contribution. And Tomoya, we share a University of York connection. I'm an associate at the University of York Centre for Applied Human Rights, and Tomoya as part of the law school in one of your roles. So I would like to propose that we turn to our first speaker. And Dr. Daniel Ogunniyi, you see in his biography there a most impressive career internationally in academic research and teaching. And also, Daniel, your international roles at the UN and elsewhere, and your particular research interests around modern slavery rights, climate-induced displacement, and human rights, all in the context of international law. So, Daniel, thank you for your time and your contribution here. I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, John, for the invitation and also for the work you do in this particular area. If you don't mind, I would like to share my screen. 1 minute. Can you see my screen?
That's all good.
Good. Again, thank you, John, for this. The question around modern slavery, what is working in tackling modern slavery? Essentially, this is a big question. And I suppose or even before addressing this question around interventions more generally, I think it's worth reflecting on the question of prevalence itself before even thinking about what is working or what is not working, let's say. The most recent estimates around modern slavery suggest that about 50 million people globally are caught up in this exploitative form in different parts of the world. And essentially what that means is about 1 in every 150 people on the planet are exploited in modern slavery. We could look back a little bit. About 20 years ago, in the mid-2000s, let's say 2005 or 2006, the global estimate at the time suggests that around roughly 25, 26 million people were caught up in modern slavery. So what that means is over a 20-year period, the number has doubled. And I think in many ways, when we're thinking about what is working, this number, as appalling as it might appear, doesn't necessarily indicate that interventions are not really working in different parts of the world, as we'll see in a minute. There is a number of programming and interventions that are moving the needle in many different ways in different parts of the world. So essentially, this let's say this huge number, what we do find is a mix of factors or drivers, or let's say determinants that actually induce modern slavery. So a mix of socioeconomic factors, political factors, structural factors in specific countries in different parts of the world. And of course, there's also, apart from the human factors, there's also partly an aspect that you could characterize as in some way non-human. I'm thinking about from climate change, for instance. Of course, we could argue that at the center of climate change itself is human activity, but it's not like the typical drivers that we often talk about. And of course, there's the conflict-induced part. So over the last few years, my work has particularly revolved around conflict-induced exploitation as well as climate-induced forms. So I just, in the interest of time, I just want to get into what we find to be working in different parts of the world. And particularly, this might address the climate aspect of it, or even broadly speaking, exploitative forms in different domains. I'm aware maybe some businesses are equally on this call. I mean, in some of our findings over the last couple of years, what we do realize is there is a number of corporate human rights due diligence laws that have been, adopted in a few countries, particularly in Europe, that seem to be working, at least in some way. There's a French duty of vigilance law, and we have the German Supply Chains Due Diligence Act. In some way, essentially, the goal is to track your supply chains and try to eliminate exploitative labor within that particular domain. Some of this might appear to be idealistic in some way, but we do find that they seem to set a standard that many companies in different parts of the world tend to model or to follow. More recently, a couple of weeks ago, there was this big news about Prada, for instance, the big retail brand, as a result of, you might characterize this as a form of self-governance. They cut off they cut ties, they severed ties with around 200 suppliers when they found compelling evidence of exploitation, modern slavery, and particularly forced labor within their supply chains. So this, human right due diligence and social auditing, they tend to yield some results in many different parts of the world. So there's, of course, this apart from Prada, there's multiple other examples that we find, even here in the UK, local retailers trying to sever ties when there's compelling evidence that exploitative labor has been utilized. And shifting focus to Africa, again, looking at interventions, just of course, what is working. There's a number of campaigns and programming that over the last few years have, produced more definitive, let's say, results on the ground. There was this campaign, Not for Sale, in Nigeria. It was supported actually with the Home Office and Defeat. They played a significant role in providing the resources in this area. And of course, if we look at extra territorial, or let's say human trafficking that originates from Africa towards Europe, for instance, or in particular Nigeria, what we do find is they tend to come from a particular region in that country, in Nigeria. um, Edo, Delta, they produce, in Italy, for instance, probably 90% of human trafficking victims sexually exploited come from this particular region of Nigeria. So this targeted response, going back to the origin, where these people usually come from, the goal is to target people within the ages of 16 and 25 and their families, trying to identify and to essentially just give knowledge to the community about the risk of irregular migration. Of course, there's this promise, this idealistic notion when people think about migration. So this project, in some way, when there's some evaluation, it does suggest that the communities are actually taking up some of these programs and the training opportunities. So so when people return also from, maybe trafficking, when they are repatriated and they go through rehabilitation process, what we do find is this program also provides support and training opportunities. So it reduces the risk of re-trafficking when there's life after trafficking, essentially. So this is one thing we find with this particular program. And also, this school anti-trafficking education and advocacy project is actually running at the minute up to probably 2027. It's funded and supported by the government of the Netherlands alongside the National Anti-Trafficking Body in Nigeria. And this particular one is quite unusual in terms of the anti-trafficking strategies we often hear of. This one engages local communities, particularly high-risk communities as well. So it's a form of education, so embedded within education of local communities, not just the students, but also the teachers. So trying to rework the curriculum of teacher training programs in Nigeria, so that when teachers are aware of the risk of human trafficking, they could impart their knowledge to their students. So we see this also taking off, and there's some early indications that the program is essentially working well, and but of course remains to be seen the full effect of how this program manifests itself on the ground. But we can estimate that when people are informed, when they have, wider knowledge about the risk of trafficking, potentially could mitigate the risk in different parts of the world, but in this case, in Nigeria. In terms of conflict, um, yeah, so some of the work I do, like I mentioned previously, interrogates the intersection of armed conflicts and exploitation. So what we do see, looking at multiple conflicts in different parts of the world, when state collapses, when in fragile context, essentially, when there's lack of support or the loss of support, whether from the state or from family members due to armed conflict, we see that the risk of exploitation usually heightens. In this particular instance, more recently, I've been studying conflicts, for instance, in Sudan, in different parts of the world. What we do find is, interestingly, the complicity of not just the non-state armed group, but also the states themselves. So, because in principle, when we study conflict and exploitation, it could be the non-state actor that tends to perpetuate exploitative labor. But here we see sexual slavery, use of child soldiers, both parties to the conflict. So, looking at the context of that hostility, what I do find in my research essentially is community-led initiatives. When communities mobilize themselves, when they come together, they're able to mitigate the risk. So, for instance, thinking about the use of child soldiers or sexual slavery, this community, they forged this alliance or this grouping network they call mutual aid network, and they provide social support to people in that community, essentially to mitigate the risk of, when there's a loss of livelihood, the risk of being vulnerable to exploitation, like we mentioned previously, highly skyrockets. But in this particular instance, there's strong evidence on the ground that with the support of these mutual aid groups, of course, trying to plug the gap, the deficit created by the state, they're able to, provide some support that in many ways diminishes the risk of exploitation. So what we do see is that community support, there's a strong correlation between community support and resilience to, to not to be vulnerable to exploitative labor or modern slavery in different forms. So we've also find this example in India and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine as well. When there's community support, the risk of getting exposed to exploitative practices often diminishes. Um, Also, I'm conscious of time. I've got probably 1 minute to go. In the context of Nigeria and many other countries in Africa, we do see law enforcement and cross-border cooperation also working actively. When there's, of course, modern slavery is a transnational crime, and when, of course, there's need for cross-border collaboration and, of course, mutual legal assistance, and this has helped greatly in terms of prosecution of perpetrators. Of course, if there's no legal understanding or less legal cooperation between countries, then this becomes highly problematic. So there's, clear evidence that people are being returned or repatriated or extradited rather to different parts of the world to face prosecution for the crimes they've committed. So some of this aspect I find to be working. I'm sorry I have to speed up, but these are some of the things we find in my work to be working. Hopefully, there'll be more time to reflect on other lessons. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And so interesting and inspiring, not just the systemic causes, but also the systemic responses. And how lovely to hear that affirmation of community and the strength, community strengthening can help reduce vulnerability, if I've understood it, and provide some measure of defense. Thank you. I hope we can return to some of those themes later on in the conversation. It's now my very great pleasure to turn to Irin Rupa. We had the honour, a colleague of AOC and I, Irin, to hear you speak last year at a supporters event for justice and care, and we were both deeply moved as well as inspired by the work you are doing. You see Irin's biography there, with her professional expertise in providing health and psychosocial support. And having heard from Daniel around multinational initiatives, Irin, it will be a great opportunity for us to hear about your work at the grassroots level, working with directly with survivors and with local and national agencies in Bangladesh. So thank you. I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, John. It's a privilege to be here to talk about something that is affecting millions worldwide, but that we can change, modern slavery. At Justice and Care in Bangladesh, we have seen firsthand that when we combine a clear vision, a smart strategy, and targeted funding, a real change is possible, not just for individuals, but for an entire country. So today, I want to share stories from Bangladesh, stories of resilience, of justice, and of transformation. Because tackling modern slavery is not just about policy, it's about people. Let's start with justice, because justice is not abstract but personal. It's the moment survivors see their trafficker held accountable. It's the moment they know the system recognizes their suffering. It's the moment the message goes out loud and clear. Exploitation will not be tolerated. From September 2023 to December 2024, Justice and Care has contributed to 69 convictions of traffickers, representing 37% of all trafficking convictions in Bangladesh during this period. It's not just a number. It's 69 victories for survivors, 69 signals that change is possible. A key part of this success is our Witness Outreach Program, which supports survivors to navigate the justice system safely. Our team works hands in hands with police, gathering intelligence, facilitating arrest, and helping victims to walk free. Just last Saturday, a young girl was rescued in Malaysia through a joint operation conducted by the Malaysian police, Stop Human Trafficking, a Malaysian NGO, and Justice and Care Bangladesh. She had traveled on a tourist visa after being promised employment, but instead she was forced into exploitation. We provide training for police, prosecutors, judges on trauma-informed, victim-centered service. It's about building a system that survivors can trust, a system that protects, not re-traumatizes. Justice is vital, but so is protection and recovery. Our repatriation and aftercare program helps survivors return home, rebuild their lives, begin to heal through counseling, medical support, educational support, legal aid, vocational training, life skill training, etc. But the most important thing we provide is simple. It's our presence, being there, whenever and wherever the survivor needs us most. One of our proudest initiatives is our Champion Survivor program, where survivors themselves become mentors, supporting others through psychosocial care, skill development, and livelihood initiatives. One such champion is a young woman whom I met in 2021. At the time, she was shy. She was not interacting with others. And what I learned from her that she couldn't return to school for a year because of social stigma. But now she is on her way to become the first female graduate of her community and has a dream to pursue her higher studies in abroad. What I admire most is her transformation into a leader. Just yesterday, she stood before representatives of government and non-government organizations and presented the Champion Survival program herself. Once silent, she now mentors others and stands as a powerful symbol of resilience, hope, and survivor-led change. Being part of stories that changes life is truly a blessing for me. Every survivor's resilience renews my commitment and reminds me that this work is not just a job for me, but a shared journey toward dignity, hope, and justice. Since 2023, Justice and Care has been working in 10 government-run shelter homes, supporting hundreds of survivors, vulnerable young women. Through specialized training, trauma-informed care, we are seeing better mental health outcome, more trusting, and deeper connection between staff and survivors. I just want to share a case of mine. I remember when I first started to work with that survivor, I was clearly told from the management that it's a gone case. She is beyond help. Irene, don't waste your time. But we started working with her. At that time, she was aggressive, violent. So we took her to psychiatric treatment, counseling training. And after few months, when I was asking her, how are you feeling? She said, the name you are calling me is not my actual name. It's a name that was given by the people here. So she gave her name, her address. We traced her family. And she returned to her home after more than 6 years. And now she is living with her family. And I really grateful to myself that I didn't give up. Prevention is just as critical. Along the Indian-Bangladesh border, we train border guards to identify potential victims early, leading to rescue before trafficking can happen. Early intervention saves life. But tackling trafficking and modern slavery, it's not just about rescue. It's about prevention. And prevention often starts with economic empowerment. So we help survivors and vulnerable families start small businesses, creating sustainable livelihoods. Now our survivors run social enterprise, generating income, leadership opportunities, and job for others. And in this way, they are becoming the earning members in their own family. So a survivor once rejected by her family, seen as a burden, is now the one that her family is depending on. Economic empowerment is not just about survival. It's about transforming communities and restoring dignity. But to make long-lasting impact, we beyond individual cases to systematic change. Justice and Care works closely with government stakeholders. For example, the Ministry of Home Affairs is adopting National Referral Mechanism software that we developed. The system tracks cases, improves victim identification, and streamlines referral nationwide. We have also introduced victim identification guidelines and mutual legal assistance protocols, enabling prosecutors to pursue cross-border cases effectively. These changes mean that every police officer, prosecutor, and frontline worker is now better equipped to fight trafficking and protect survivors, not just to react, but to prevent exploitation. In Bangladesh, we are seeing the power of strategy, collaboration, and survivor-centered approaches. We are holding traffickers accountable, empowering survivors, transforming systems, and creating opportunities that prevent exploitation before it happens. The lesson is clear. Tackling modern slavery requires both heart and strategy. Together, we can continue turning the tide, bringing hope, freedom, and dignity to those who needed it most. Thank you.
Thank you, Irin. So beautiful to hear your words and for giving a human face to your work. The stories you shared have been so moving to hear. And well, Daniel, you spoke about economic empowerment, and Irin, it's lovely to hear an example of how a family can be transformed, not just an individual, through that support. Thank you, Irin, and wishing you and your team all our love and courage and strength for the work you're doing. So we turn to our third speaker. And again, my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Tomoya Obokata to this panel. As well as his role at the University of York Law School and his former roles in academia, Professor Obokata is also fulfilling the profoundly important role of Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery for the United Nations. And you see from his biography there, his work internationally, his engagement with international governments and institutions, and also intergovernmental organizations within the UN on drugs and crime office, International Office for Migration, and the European Union. Professor Obokata, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and I'll hand the floor to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John, first of all, for inviting me to this panel this afternoon. And I also wanted to thank Daniel and Irin for sharing your expertise and experience. And it's very encouraging to see some of the good things happening on the ground. For my part, I would like to start by emphasizing the importance of international standards on modern slavery. Under international human rights law, for example, there are treaties such as the Slavery Convention, which actually is 100 years old this year, as it was adopted in 1926 in Geneva. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as regional treaties such as the European Convention on Human Rights, which oblige state parties to address slavery, servitude, and forced labor. Under international labor law, the Forced Labor Convention and the Worst Forms of Child Labor Convention are important instruments along with other treaties. In addition, there are others like the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. And undoubtedly, these and other instruments, treaties, have helped states to improve their domestic legal frameworks to address modern slavery and their capacity to investigate and prosecute perpetrators, protect victims, and prevent modern slavery one way or another. And treaties like the UN Organized Crime Convention additionally serves as a legal basis to promote international criminal justice cooperation, a point touched upon by Irin just earlier, like extradition and mutual legal assistance in criminal matters, as well as joint investigation, given the transnational nature of modern slavery in many cases. However, these instruments are far from perfect, as they have done very little so far to strengthen accountability for businesses, employers, recruitment or migration agencies, and other legal entities which may engage in or facilitate modern slavery directly or indirectly. And this is one of the reasons why I fully support the global call to strengthen human rights due diligence among them so that they can prevent modern slavery before occurring. And this point was briefly touched upon by a fellow panelist, Daniel, earlier as well. But I want to elaborate on this a little bit for our discussion. The key international standard, of course, is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. And simply put, human rights due diligence is a process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for adverse human rights impacts arising from their business operations and relationships. That, of course, include modern slavery, such as forced and child labor. And here I see some promising practices at the national level. Countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada have so far opted to promote transparency in supply chains through reporting and disclosure. And interestingly, New Zealand just has introduced a bill on this particular disclosure and reporting just last week. And others have gone further to adopt mandatory human rights due diligence with legal obligations to identify and mitigate the risks of modern slavery and imposition of penalties for non-compliance. Daniel kindly explained, mentioned a couple of countries there like Germany, so I will not go further. But at the European level, the European Union has adopted a directive, a legally binding directive on human rights due diligence, which will be applicable to all member states by 2027. Another interesting measure is an import ban on goods produced as a result of modern slavery. Now, legal basis for this is free trade agreements like the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement of 2018 and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership among Asian countries, plus some others like the UK, Canada, and Australia. And during my tenure, I have had chances to meet with businesses and employers, and I can say that many are already aware of the importance of human rights due diligence and import ban, and many have started making changes to their business operations and relationships in order to ensure that the workers' rights are protected. And I believe that this is a positive step forward. But these are, of course, not silver bullets, and there are some issues which need to be addressed, even for human rights due diligence and import ban as they currently stand. But due to lack of time, I will not touch upon those at the moment, but perhaps we can have that conversation later. With regard to international or multilateral initiatives, I would like to mention the work done by Alliance 8.7, which is a global partnership consisting of states, international organizations like ILO, trade unions, and civil society organizations. The number 8.7 comes from the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 8, Target 8.7, which calls on states to eradicate modern slavery by 2030. Countries which join the alliance make firm commitment to address child and forced labor, and alliance supports them to develop and implement national strategies and other innovative ways to address modern slavery by working in partnership with other stakeholders. And I have had a chance to visit various countries which are part of the alliance during my tenure, where I was able to observe some positive results on the ground in eradicating labor exploitation. What I would like to emphasize here is the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach. While the governments bear the primary responsibility to address modern slavery, from my own experience, effective and meaningful actions are more likely to be developed and implemented when states create an environment where all states, including trade unions, civil society, and victims and survivors themselves, are able to work together. And I have seen this firsthand through my country visits and other engagements on the ground. Regionally, there is a so-called Bali process to combat human trafficking and migrant smuggling. This consists of countries in Asia Pacific and some in Europe and Latin America, as well as international organizations. It promotes policy dialogues through regular meetings and conducts research on emerging issues and provide capacity building for stakeholders like law enforcement and public authorities. The key here is mutual learning and sharing of good practices, which is essential in promoting effective actions against modern slavery globally. And I believe that the initiatives like this continue to make important contributions in this regard. Finally, in Europe, the European Union already has established bodies such as Europol and Eurojust, which regularly conducts joint investigation into modern slavery involving multiple EU member states, and similar practices are emerging in various parts of the world. Thank you very much. I will stop here and I'll be very happy to expand on any of these points later. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tomoya. I was struck by your phrase, enabling environments, creating conditions in which organizations such as Irin's are able to find traction. And although this webinar isn't specifically a strategic contextual analysis of how what is working, already we're hearing about joining strategy, collaboration, and survivor-led approaches. Irin, that was your contribution. And adding in around enabling environments, a international legislative framework, which is already 100 years in making, building on national legislation prior to that, since the origins of the historic transatlantic slave trade. So thank you, all three of you, and please, for those who are listening in, please do add your comments or your questions. What strikes me for the three of you, as I hear, is the overlapping experience and interest that you bring from whichever level you're bringing. And I wondered if there was anything that any of you each had said that you wanted to respond to. Danielle, I don't know, as you spoke first, and you've had the opportunity of hearing the others, was there anything that you would add? And then perhaps Irin, and then Tomoya, I can turn to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Irin, for wonderful presentations. Yes, I think both are quite compelling, and in some way they show the appalling, numbers. These are not just statistics, these are people behind the numbers. So when I, just to pick up from what Tomoya just said now about multi-stakeholder initiative, I think this is particularly this should be the direction of travel, let's say, because oftentimes you see fragmentation, apart from, of course, few collaborations, but oftentimes the entire space is fragmented. And thinking particularly about irregular migration, or even regular migrations, like people moving from Africa to the Middle East, increasingly these days, what we do see is that there isn't any strong collaboration or cooperation between countries. People are usually at the mercy of the private employers in the country of destination. So I think this idea of collaboration, multi-country collaboration, even multi-stakeholder collaboration, in many ways could break the market for these perpetrators in many different ways. So I think that was one point that I thought about, that increasingly working in silos wasn't cases, the reality for victims. And also in terms of human rights due diligence framework, at the minute, apart from the few examples we have, of course, I'm glad to hear Tom from his country visit identify good practices in different areas. But at the same time, looking at the UK, where we are at the minute, I suppose Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, and yes, I think there's still need for stronger legal enforcement and even legislative action as well. The legal framework is more like a tick box approach once you're able to complete your Modern Slavery Act statement, let's say. So if Tesco, Aldi, or Asda, whatever they are, if they're just able to complete a statement, the content does not even matter. So you complete that statement, put it on your website, and that's it. So no strong penalties for, let's say, complicity or exploitation within their practice. So I think the need for stronger legislation and of course stronger legal action more broadly will be particularly helpful here. And also turning to Irin's presentation, I think I find a number of parallels in what she does with her work, and a number of private actors, especially in Africa, where my work tends to focus on. But I think one dominant trend I also see is that many of these initiatives are externally driven. Donor countries are the ones really working in this particular space. Of course, they collaborate with local actors, and of course, maybe one thing I also see more than anything else is the fact that the focus is usually on transnational trafficking, extraterritorial trafficking. Not, we tend to ignore the fact that people get trafficked within a country, and in fact, the highest number revolve within the country, movement within the country, but questions around rehabilitation, psychosocial support, all these trauma-informed approaches, they tend to heavily focus on people that, cross borders, so, international or transnational victims of trafficking, not particularly on domestic population, which unfortunately is the sort of the higher volume or the higher share of victims in this area. So essentially, these are some of the links I could immediately connect. Yeah, I think I'll just stop here in the interest of time. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. And I believe that's right for the UK, that UK nationals constitute the largest proportion of slaves in the UK, if I've understood the data correctly, which is can be, and I suspect that's replicated in, well, as you indicate, in every country around the world. Thank you, Daniel. And hearing your pronunciation of Irin's name, Irin, I wanted to make sure that I have your name correctly, especially given you brought an example of somebody who was given the wrong name. Can you help us? How you like to be addressed?
It's Irin.
Irin.
Irin, yeah.
Irin. Okay. Thank you. My apologies. And Irin, I wondered if you wanted to respond to what you'd heard Daniel say, or Tomoya.
Thank you, John. It was really pleasing to hear from Daniel and Tomoya, because when both of you are speaking, I was feeling validated, because most of the time I was feeling connected. When Daniel was talking about the different types of campaign and school anti-trafficking advocacy project, that's actually we are doing in Bangladesh, and we have seen the result of it, because in Bangladesh, in rural community, this campaign really helps. Now we first intel we get from the school campaign we have done, or the community campaign. So when we got the intel that a person is being rescued, is going to be trafficked from this route, we can help her, we can save her. So I was feeling connected. And when Tomoya was talking about multidisciplinary system and sharing with other stakeholders, it's really helpful. And especially in Bangladesh, we are creating evidence to show that this works, because most of the initially when I started and our organization started, survivors will be seen as problematic, troublemaker, responsible for their own suffering and beyond help. But now when we are creating evidence, the system with this our approaches. So it's really great to hear from you, and feeling really connected, validated that we are on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you, Irin. It's lovely to hear that experience and connection. And there's some questions coming in. But first, Tomoya, I wondered if you wanted to respond to anything that you've heard from your colleagues here.
Yes, there's common perhaps theme from both panelists, Irin and Daniel, which is the need to address root causes of modern slavery. It is not simply enough to prosecute and punish perpetrators and protect victims, as long as there are root causes that pushes them into exploitation. That's this vicious cycle continues. So importance importance of this has been raised by both of you, and I think that, and I fully agree, a need to provide access to quality and free education for children and young people, access to decent work, access to housing, access to social safety net, and financial inclusion of those at risk. I mean, these are quite important, and I've seen from my experience as a special rapporteur on the ground, I mean, these things are what's being done at the community level. Once again, the bottom-up approach of people working together to provide these is important, and it is for the government to ensure that environment is sustained. And Irene, I also, fully agree with your point about the need for individually tailored, trauma-informed, gender-sensitive culturally appropriate and age and appropriate measures. And that many governments tend to have a one-size-fits-all approach in protection, and that certainly is not going to work. It hasn't worked, and it never will work. So, and I think what you're doing there is of extremely importance, and I'm glad to hear that you are providing the services. And in face, as you might know, the UN is facing a crisis, financial crisis, and many of these agencies are not functioning. But even worse, that shrinking civic space in various countries and lack of funding for civil society is quite concerning. So I would like to join force with civil society organizations like yourselves, that lobbying the international community to do more to support someone like yourselves. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you, Tomoya. And Tomoya, you particularly mentioned business and regulation of businesses. And it's interesting that two questions that have come in some way reflect that. One commenting about the importance of moving powerful corporate actors. Thank you, Eric, for your comment here about encouraging businesses to act more ethically. Recognizing that it has implications for cost cutting and taking advantage of poor labor conditions and so on. And Helen, your question about, there's a question about linking the deep patterns of exploitation and extraction of human and natural resources, the connection between extraction of resources and extraction from people, and how much this characterizes the landscape of modern slavery. We had a speaker on a previous AOEC webinar who talked about combating businesses, and he said, I treat them as competitors, business competitors, and I compete against them as if I'm trying to defeat their business model, to make it difficult for them to act. After all, they are just another business. Their trade is in people. So for all three of you, I wonder about Helen's question there, how patterns of exploitation and extraction of human and natural resources are unconnected. I don't know who that might speak to first as a response.
I'm happy to go. Yes, of course, this is one thing I do see in my research, particularly looking at climate change as a driver for exploitation in particular. So this transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy in particular, we see how it tends to exacerbate conditions for local communities. Of course, the popular ones we know, the cobalt mining in the DRC, the Uyghur exploitation of the Uyghur region and things of that nature. Usually, I like to characterize this as part of the unintended consequences of this transition process to renewable energy, because oftentimes it is supposed to be a force for good, but at the same time, at the heart of it is exploitative labor in many different ways. And I think it comes back to the question of the obligation of businesses. And because oftentimes it is this large multinational entities that perpetuate this form of practices. So I think questions around mandatory legal framework in some way could play a role in this particular area, not just all this, legal standards or that do not really specify penalties and things of that nature. And I think apart from businesses, people as well, who are the consumers of these products, I think we do have a role to play as well in mitigating some of these challenges. But generally, I think we could start from the legal framework, particularly mandatory framework. So what we do find, as Tomoya mentioned, is many of the standards are, dominant in Europe and to a lesser degree in other parts of the world. some of this mandatory framework in particular. It's just a select country of number of countries that do have those standards. And of course, they need to strengthen labor regulations in the countries, in the particular sites or locations where these exploitative practices take place. I think in some way it could also mitigate the risk that local populations are exposed to. But yeah, I'd like to hear from the other panelists too. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can comment on that because I
Yes.
just visited last year I visited Brazil, and that's where you can see the clear linkage between climate crisis and exploitation, because there's lots of like illegal that mining, logging, and cattle raising and so on, destroying the environment, and they are using these people to do these things. So where you see people being exploited to actually damage the environment, as well as human rights defenders, environmental defenders are being, threatened, and so on. As I've seen, so I'll be publishing a full report later this year. I will be making a series of recommendations. But then I think there is that relationship, and I do agree with Daniel. I mean, I advocate for stronger due diligence reporting, and so on is good. I mean, it's nothing wrong with that. But as he said, if there's no teeth, penalty regime, it just becomes a ticking box exercise. And I think that's the reason why some of these pre-existing arrangements in UK and Australia and so on are being criticized and so on. But there is also a fine question as to how far should that go. I mean, if you talk about big businesses, yes, of course they can afford to do it. I mean, if they say, well, it costs too much, but that is not an excuse. But here we see the vast majority of the cases of modern slavery happens further down the supply chain in Africa, Asia, and so on, where they do not even have a capacity to conduct human rights due diligence. So what does that mean in terms of the obligation of states, first and foremost, and also the responsibility of these large businesses further up in the supply chains who benefit from all of these, cheap goods and services? I think that's an important question that we ought to be asking. So these are not unsolved. I don't think there's any right, answer to it in my view. And I also, fully agree with Daniel's last point about the consumers. That's one of the root causes. Why are they being exploited? Because we consumer keep wanting cheap goods and services. In UK, Europe, United States, Japan, that's the reason. So I think we need to raise awareness among us consumers and see how these things are being produced. And once they see that, perhaps they are able to learn more. And I completely agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomoya, and for reminding us that on our high streets anywhere in the world, modern slavery is hiding in plain sight in terms of the consumer choices that we could make. And Irin, to close us out, I don't know if you wanted to comment on the language of extraction and exploitation as you see them in your work.
Yeah, I totally agree with Daniel and Tomoya. Actually, in Bangladesh, there is several areas that where we work in, and it's very prone to natural disaster like cyclone, different types of storm. So there are people living in the side. They usually try to they're like the consumer theory you share, both of them share, is the rate of trafficking and modern slavery and the victim is really high in those areas. And trafficker point out and target those girls from these areas because their poverty is financial condition is very low. So we also see that there is a connection.
Thank you. And I'm aware too of people in vulnerable states of mental health and the risks of exposure then to being trafficked or controlled. We're coming to the end of the time and the questions are piling in. Thank you, everyone. There was an earlier question, we will close in just a moment, about what is the role of coaches. Thank you, Eric, for your question there. If we coach in particular industries, natural resource extraction, hospitality, construction, IT, and especially agriculture. We will be working with organizations and companies that are at risk from being infiltrated by modern slavers. That may be a question to bring into our conversations with our clients around the protection of supply chains and the well-being of all people that they engage with, not just their own employees. So thank you all. We will bring it to a close. I'm sorry there's not been time for every question to be asked. If you would be interested in learning more about our modern slavery work at the AOEC, there is a link there. If you would be interested in pro bono coaching for those working or volunteering in modern slavery organizations, please do contact us. And we will be running our annual free online 2-day coaching skills certificate for those who work or volunteer in modern slavery organizations. And I've seen from the participants here today, there are some graduates of that program. It's a great honor to support people in their work through sharing coaching skills. All details there on our webpage. It remains for me only to say thank you to the three of you, to Irin, to Tomoya, and to Daniel, for the gifts you have given us all through your contribution here today. I'm delighted you've had a chance to talk with each other, as well as to share your experience and expertise. Thank you, everyone, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.